Have you ever found yourself not really appreciating something until you experienced what the alternative was? This past week we enjoyed sitting out the back to eat dinner a couple of nights. And having been in Kansas last summer, one of the things that it made us appreciate about the UK is that you can sit outside at tea time here and not get absolutely eaten alive by mosquitoes. Before we saw the alternative, we didn't think eating outside and not getting eaten yourself was a big deal. But having seen the alternative, we now appreciate what we have even more. Though I'm sure some of our brothers and sisters from Kansas who've been here will go back and say that there are things back there that they appreciate having seen the alternative here. Maybe some of us as children thought it would be fun to live in someone else's house for a while without the same rules and restrictions. But then we went to someone else's house after school, or we went for a sleepover, and we couldn't wait to get home. And it can be the same with God's law. There was a stage, as I mentioned earlier, in C.S. Lewis's life where he found the idea of delighting in God's law very strange. In fact, he said he found the Psalm writer's delight in God's law to be utterly bewildering. But then he thought about it and he realized that the Jews had as their immediate neighbors pagans of the worst kind. And he says that when a Jew looked at that pagan worship, when he thought of sacred prostitution, sacred sodomy, and babies thrown into the fire for Molech, his own law, as he turned back to it, must have shone with extraordinary radiance. So God's law shines with extraordinary radiance when we compare it to how those around us live. And for many it also shines with an extraordinary radiance when they compare it to how they themselves used to live. And from that perspective, Exodus 16 contains something which may look restrictive, but is actually a great gift. And that's the first thing we're going to see from the chapter in front of us this evening. We're going to see a gift, a test, and a signpost. So three things. If you can remember a gift, a test, and a signpost, it'll help you remember what this chapter is about. And firstly, we see a gift. A gift. Exodus 16 contains the first explicit command about observing the Sabbath in the Bible. Some say that the Sabbath didn't exist before the Ten Commandments, and yet here it is 4 chapters earlier. And in fact, the Sabbath is much older than Exodus 16. Why did God rest in the beginning? Well, it wasn't because he was tired and needed a rest. It was to set a pattern for us. Along with marriage and with work, the Sabbath is what's known as a creation ordinance. In a perfect world, before sin ever entered, there was still marriage, there was still work, and there was still the Sabbath. But one of the beautiful things about the Sabbath regulations in this chapter is that they are given to former slaves. Slaves who never had a day off. In fact, it's very interesting that there's a phrase used in this chapter, and the only other place it's used in Exodus is back in chapter 5. In chapter 16, it's that bit in verse 4 where it talks about gathering a day's portion. And the same phrase is used twice back in chapter 5 by their Egyptian taskmasters when they were forced to make bricks without straw. Complete your work, your daily task each day, as when there was straw. So in Exodus 16, it's translated as a day's portion. In Exodus 5, it's translated as your daily task. But it's the exact same phrase in the original language. And so we're meant to see a contrast between the two chapters. Back in Egypt, as recorded in chapter 5, they weren't given straw. That meant that their work increased, and yet they were required to produce the same output every day. Here in Exodus 16, some gather a lot and some gather a little, but the output is guaranteed by God. Verse 18, but when they had measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And then on the seventh day, God himself provides. They have no bread to gather, no work is required. It is grace upon grace. No wonder verse 29 says, see, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Just as the Lord had given them bread in verse 15, so he had given them the Sabbath in verse 29. It is a gift. It is grace upon grace. It's only been a month since the Passover. It's not that long since they've been slaves in Egypt. Working day in, day out, without ever a break. No weekends, no May Day, bank holiday, no Sabbath. Just constant, unrealistic demands put upon them. The Egyptian gods demanding every hour and minute of their time, 7 days a week. And so what a gift for these recently freed slaves to be given the Sabbath. And for many of them, it would have shined with extraordinary radiance. And some of us have come to see what a gift the Lord's Day is when compared to what the alternative is. In school, the times that I particularly appreciated the Lord's Day was at exam time, especially when there was an exam on a Monday morning. Because on the Sunday, everyone else would be panicking about the exam, doing last-minute revision, but I could enjoy the day. Because it was a day I'd never done homework, it was a day I'd never done revision, and so the thought of studying on the Lord's Day never crossed my mind. And actually it probably meant doing better in the exam because it meant you were going in fresher, even if there was an early start on the Monday morning to have a quick look over things. And it's at times like that when it's particularly clear that the Lord's Day is a gift. When we see others around us stressed and anxious and trying to cram and work, and we can just rest and trust God. When we see up close what the alternative is, it makes us appreciate what God has given us so much more. And sometimes gifts do require a bit of preparation. Like gathering a double portion the day before. Like farmers doing more on the Saturday, so they only need to do the essentials on God's Day. Like the rest of us doing food shopping and meal preparation and housework the day before. Most people in our world manage to plan in advance for Christmas when the shops will be shut for one day, and they do it gladly because they know it'll be worth it. Because they have better things to do on Christmas Day than go to a supermarket. They see Christmas as a gift and they prepare accordingly. And we should have the same attitude to the Lord's Day. See it as a gift and prepare accordingly. Derek Thomas once put it like this. He said, Satan wants every minute of our time, and secular society squeezes every last minute of our energy for little lasting reward. Make no mistake about it, he says, a world without a Sabbath is tyrannical and unforgiving. It has no gospel. A world without a Sabbath is tyrannical and unforgiving. It has no gospel. And so the first thing we see in this chapter is a gift that shines more brightly against the dark backdrop of Egypt. A month ago they were slaves in Egypt, making bricks without straw, relentless demands constantly placed upon them. But the Lord redeemed them and gave them the Sabbath, or gave them back the Sabbath, And so, verse 30, the people rested on the seventh day. So firstly, we see a gift. Secondly, we see a test. A test. While the Sabbath is a gift, it's also a test. Verse 4, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. And it's a test that's given to a grumbling people. For 3 chapters in a row here, the people grumble. We read about it at the end of the last chapter, chapter 15, verse 24. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" We'll see it again early in the next chapter, chapter 17, verse 3. But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses. And we find it here in chapter 16, verse 2. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Or did they grumble against Moses and Aaron? Because here's the question, who were they really grumbling against? The verses that I read say they grumbled against Moses or Moses and Aaron, but that's only on the surface level. Because what does Moses tell them in verse 8? The Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. And of course, if you'd asked the people, they would have said the opposite. They would have said, "Oh no, we're not grumbling against the Lord. We're only grumbling against Moses." But as they grumble against the leaders God has appointed, they're actually grumbling against the Lord, which is perhaps not irrelevant to churches today. It's not unusual in churches for there to be a lot of grumbling and complaining against the leaders that God has appointed, a lot of which the leaders don't actually know about, as it's done behind closed doors. Now, people wouldn't call what they're doing grumbling, even if it is. And they certainly wouldn't say that they're grumbling against the Lord. But the Israelites in the wilderness wouldn't have said that either. And yet they were. Does that mean that the elders of a church are 6 feet above contradiction? That all their decisions are infallible? That they never get things wrong? That people can't raise complaints and concerns? Not at all. We saw this morning, in fact, how Priscilla and Aquila gently took Apollos aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. They didn't complain about him behind closed doors for months and let it build up in their heads until they finally exploded in a torrent of criticism and grievances. Priscilla and Aquila are a model of graciously raising concerns. And Apollos is a model of humbly responding. But the complaining in these chapters is night and day different. And to this grumbling, complaining people, God gives a test. Verse 4, the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." So what sort of test is it? Well, it is a test of obedience and a test of trust, which are effectively the same thing. Will they trust God enough to obey him? Will they trust God enough to obey him? That's the question. On a regular day, verse 19, on a weekday, will they trust God enough not to leave any manna until the next morning? And then on the Sabbath, verse 27, will they trust God enough not to try and go out and gather on the one day he has set aside for himself? In both situations, the question is whether they'll trust God to provide in the future. Will they trust him to provide their daily bread and so not try and hoard up the day before? And will they trust him enough to gather double on the 6th day and rest on the 7th? So how does this apply to us? Is it saying we should do a daily shop in Morrison's rather than a weekly one? Well, not necessarily, though it is warning us of the danger of self-sufficiency, of thinking we have full cupboards and freezers, and if we do, we're okay and we don't need to look to God to provide. Someone has said we amass for ourselves mounds of stuff we do not need and will never use, but what we do not realize is the corrosive effects of abundance. It leads to pride and the myth of self-sufficiency. God was trying to teach this in the corruption of the unneeded manna. Having lots of stuff that we do not need, it will corrupt. And we can hoard as individuals, we can also hoard as churches. But here's another way one pastor applied this passage to a couple in his congregation. There's caution here, rebuke perhaps, but there's also encouragement. This couple's 5-year-old daughter had been diagnosed with a brain tumour. She was diagnosed on the Tuesday and spent 9 hours in surgery on the Wednesday. Then she started into a year-long process of treatment. And the pastor found it so helpful to be able to say to that couple, we don't have to worry about how we'll cope in 3 months' time. We can just take one day at a time. We trust God for today, and we trust that He will enable us to trust Him tomorrow and in 3 months' time. It's the same principle as what Jesus says. Tomorrow has enough worries for itself. It's about trusting God each day. Sometimes people think about the martyrs, like the Covenanters who've given their life for Christ, and they wonder if they would have the same courage to give their life for Christ today, if that's what they were called to do. But here we have a reminder that God gives us the grace we need for each particular day. And so there's no point wondering ahead of time how we might cope in such a situation, how we might cope if that one person were to pass away, or how we would cope if we were to face a set of circumstances that a fellow Christian is facing right now. We see them facing it and we wonder, well, how would we cope if that was us? But there's no point wondering, because God will give us the grace we need once we're in that situation, not before. And we could also, as we've already done with the children, apply this to daily Bible reading. Not everybody in the world today has a Bible in their own language, and not everybody is able to read. But if we can read, if we have Bibles in our own language, then surely we want to be gathering daily manna from God's Word, daily bread. And the Sabbath itself is still a test today. A test to see whether we'll trust God, if we'll trust Him not to work. Think of the farmer who wakes up on a Sunday morning, the sun is splitting the stones, the harvest isn't all in yet, and torrential rain is forecast for the Monday. What will he do? The Sabbath is a test to see whether we'll trust God, and to see whether we'll love Him enough to devote a whole day to Him. Someone has said that a person's reaction to the gift of a day to be set apart for God was a fair indicator of their spiritual temperature. The day is called the Lord's Day, not the Lord's morning. There are plenty who are happy to worship God in the morning, but then to treat the rest of the day as their own, or vice versa. And yet God doesn't call us to devote 7 days to Him, though by rights He could. He doesn't call us to devote 6 days to Him. It's just one day of the week. How tragic it would be if we begrudged that, if we found that wearisome, if we couldn't take one day off work and shopping and entertainment. The Sabbath is a test. But what's the reward for keeping it? If we pass the test, as it were. Well, gloriously, the reward is God himself. Isaiah 58. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honourable, if you honour it, not going your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord, and I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So far then, in this chapter, we've seen a gift, we've seen a test. Thirdly, and finally, we see a signpost. A signpost. What is manna? Well, actually, that's sort of what the name means. Verse 15, what is it? The Hebrew word man means what? So the name itself is a question. Boys and girls, if you remember Karis, her dad used to have a children's talk about manna where he'd bring in a bag of whatsits. What is it? It's a whatsit. The name itself is a question. And it was the same with manna. And it was just like nothing they'd ever experienced. Imagine having new food, but it's just so different from what you've had before that you can barely describe it. Looking back years later in Deuteronomy 8, Moses would say, "He fed you with manna that you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Isn't that nice? He gave them something that they didn't know, so that they might come to know something. That man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And the Lord gives the people manna after they complain. The first 3 verses of the chapter are pretty shocking. The people set out from Elim. What had happened at Elim? Well, if we look up to the last verse of the previous chapter, there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees. Surely if God could bring them somewhere like that, surely if God could make bitter water sweet as he had done immediately before that, then surely they could trust him to sort out the food situation. But they don't. And what really takes a biscuit isn't simply that they complain in verse 2, but what they say in verse 3. When they talk about sitting by the meat pots in Egypt and eating bread to the full. Because that's pretty far from reality, isn't it? They're suddenly looking back at their lives of slavery with rose-tinted glasses. Perhaps you think back to a time in your own life and you say, "I never had it so good." But often we forget the hard things and just remember the good bits. It's God's kindness in a way when we can forget the hard things, but it does mean that we can look back with rose-tinted glasses. So there are lots of details in this chapter that are instructive and that we could zoom in on in more detail. But just as we begin to draw things to a close tonight, I want to ask, what's the big picture here? What's the big picture in Exodus 16? Well, it's God providing for his people in the wilderness, giving them bread from heaven. There's a vast crowd of hungry people. They don't know where food is going to come from, and the Lord feeds them. And that will be very significant when we get to the New Testament. Did you know, boys and girls, did you know that there's only one miracle recorded in all 4 Gospels? That's surprising, isn't it? I find that surprising. There's only one miracle that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. Any guesses? It's the feeding of the 5,000. And not only is it Jesus' most recorded miracle, recorded 4 times, it's also his most witnessed miracle. He fed 5,000 men, not including women and children, so it's easily 20,000 plus. So it's obviously pretty significant. Jesus' most recorded miracle, his most witnessed miracle. And here's the Old Testament background. What was one of the fundamental things that a Jew knew about God? Well, they knew that their God was the one who provided for his people in the wilderness. They knew it because of this chapter. They knew it because he had done so for 40 years. And then what happens when Jesus comes into this world? He provides for his people in the wilderness. Send the crowds away, the disciples told him, for this is a desolate place. This is a wilderness place. But Jesus didn't send them away. Instead, he fed them. Here in verse 7, Moses and Aaron tell the people, in the morning you shall see the glory of God. And they did. But we have seen the glory of God even more clearly than they did. And we have seen it in the face of Jesus Christ. When he came to earth, he made the connection himself. He said, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. People around us are living with a spiritual hunger. They're looking for satisfaction in all the wrong places. And yet we have the living bread to hold out to them. And one day the words of the Apostle John will be true of us. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. They will hunger no more, neither thirst any more. The sun shall not strike them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb in the midst of the throne will be their shepherd, and he will guide them to springs of living water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And because of Jesus, because of the living bread who came down from heaven for the life of the world, this can be the reality for all of us. Amen. We'll close this evening with Psalm 78a, singing about the manna. Psalm 78a, page 172, it's verses 8 to 11. Psalm 78a, page 172, verses 8 to 11. The tune will be 266. Verse 8 there on page 172. They tested God within their hearts. With greed they asked for food. They spoke out against God thus. No, against God, not against Moses and Aaron. Can he lay a table in the desert? Verse 9. But can he also give us bread? Can he provide meat for his folk? And then verse 10, in the middle of the verse. He opened heaven's doors, and thus on them he manna did rain down to eat. He gave them heaven's grain. Man ate the bread of angels, and from his abundance they were fed. In the wilderness, they ate the bread of angels. But we have something even better. We have the Scriptures, things into which the angels long to look. So Psalm 78a, 8 to 11, if you're able, we'll stand to sing praise.